anything. They still, I mean, you know, you can't stop. I mean, if the PRC out of bloody-mindedness for some activity on Taiwan wants to punish Taiwan, they can. There's not anything anyone can do about that. But again, the cost can be made very high to deny the PRC its objectives if they want to do so by force. I won't go down all the capabilities, and if you have questions on any of them, we'll talk about them. I think everyone knows in the most recent defense white paper from Beijing, the idea of not a complete shift yet, but a shifting from, you know, sort of the near seas to far seas operations in the maritime domain. So they're focused on both right now, and on the shift. They got a much broader distribution of their air defense capabilities in the maritime domain, more modern submarine fleet. They still have problems with anti-submarine warfare, but they're taking some measures there. But it is a vulnerability, and one that needs to be paid attention to. But I guess, again, to strike a bit more of these last three bullets, trying to be somewhat more optimistic. I think that a new DPP government will have some time. There's going to be friction. They will have some time to figure out how to creatively manage that friction and to find a way to work with Beijing before Beijing probably feels that it's not worth the effort and we have the military capabilities to use that tool and to change the dynamic. So I see still, hopefully from Beijing's perspective, this idea that a strategic window of opportunity still exists. That out to 2020 at least, until unfortunately they develop even more military capabilities, that there's some time to work with Taiwan and potentially to avoid sort of, like I say, some very highly and quickly escalating situation, or some decision by Beijing that we're just going to need to compel this because time is no longer on our side. I think 2020 is kind of a watershed for this. Yes, sir.
Don't you think that, from Beijing's point of view, a much more effective lever would be through economic means rather than the military?
Yes, I think they do.
And do you feel that the leadership of DPP understands that? That they're sort of under a economic blackmail, or so to speak?
I don't know if they view it as economic blackmail. I think that the DPP reads the Taiwan populace correctly in assessing that Taiwan's voting populace doesn't buy off on something that I think helped the Kuomintang over the last several years, which is this idea that if we make these economic agreements and other agreements with China, that it's going to help us out in the pocketbook. Taiwan's populace doesn't believe that because it hasn't helped them out that much in the pocketbook. It really hasn't been that great a benefit, at least not to a large number of folks in Taiwan, certainly to some. So I worry that they may place a little too much emphasis in the other, you know, in the other direction. That they may believe that Beijing thinks the economic relationship will be sufficient over time, and that they can continue to sort of buy the status quo by being, you know, somewhat agreeable in the economic domain. I don't know. Like I said, I don't think after 2020 that Beijing is going to feel that way anymore. If elections continue, or even occasionally, disprove this idea that the economic interdependence is working in their favor, at some point, you know, aren't they going to say that, well, that plan isn't working? That policy approach of focusing on some of these economic and cultural issues will eventually buy us what we want. If Beijing assesses that no, it's really not working that way because, you know, democracies, unfortunately, you know, don't necessarily, you know, work in accordance with Beijing's plans. At some point, do they say enough of this? Time's not on our side anymore? I'm not saying that I necessarily buy that that's where we'll be. I think if there's not some creative moves towards some diplomatic dialogue over the next 4 to 5 years, we're going to be in that area, and it could be a lot more dangerous. But I agree with you, sort of that point, that at least for the present, probably for another 4 years, I hope, this idea of stressing the economic benefits, even though the Taiwans I don't think right now see it as that great a benefit, but stressing that is still going to be the primary focus of their approach. I worry that that might not be the case after 2020 or approaching 2020. And if it isn't, then will you see a? I'm not saying that that's a point at which there's a go switch to do something really high end and bad. It's just that there might be a willingness then to press more often. If Beijing feels like Taiwan is treating us as a paper tiger, that our threats are empty. At some point, the willingness to push a little harder against those goads might be in play. So, I kind of the idea of Xi Jinping potentially opening the door to Tsai Ing-wen under some kind of spirit of the 1992 consensus or whatever. Something like that. I think that's still in play, and I think that there's some room for creative dialogue and maneuvering here. But I think that looking at Xi Jinping's personality, his leadership style, he's not going to allow Taiwan to control how that works. I mean, I expect around and after the election time that you're going to see. You will see some messaging from Beijing about how Xi Jinping reads the future and what he thinks that a new paradigm, or a paradigm, if you will, because he's not one who's going to let somebody else define the status quo, and that's obviously kind of what Tsai Ing-wen wants to do right now, and her voters will buy that. But when she's actually in charge, will that work? Xi Jinping is not likely to let sort of her or the party or their alliance define how that looks. I think you just had that question. I think prior to 2020, your economic and some diplomatic levers are still most likely, but that's going to be an environment of more friction. I mean, there may be some reversals to several of the 23 or so agreements. Might happen very quickly after the election. Beijing may send a quick signal and say, they're going to turn certain things around just because they're not happy. Don't know that that's going to happen, but it could, and it'll be sort of in that economic realm. The PRC's evolving approach to how they view deterrence and coercion, it's going to be a more volatile environment, I believe. And the reason for that is that right now, I mean, if you look at writings on deterrence that come out of China and on war control, even though they've only been talking about it for maybe about 10 years now, with it's been showing up in sort of the strategic writings and dialogue. But when they do use it, they use deterrence really differently than Westerners do, than we do, generally speaking, because it does have some kinetic components. It has components of actual use of military force on some scale, which is meant to be a deterrent signal. It's meant to be something that all parties can and should step back from. The problem with that is that may be how one party reads it, that may be how Beijing reads it, but that's certainly, if you're in sort of the security dilemma behavior environment, that's not how other parties are going to read it, particularly the U.S. potentially. So you don't want to see China using their military as a means to control crisis. And you see a lot of that, a fair amount of that in the writings right now. So we can use our military, and they can even use force. They can even potentially take lives, and it's a way of controlling a crisis and building an opportunity, and that's kind of scary. This idea of turning crisis into opportunity. So if there is kind of an inflection point because of Xi Jinping's ability to reorganize the PLA, his assertiveness as a leader, you're likely to see, I think, a little bit more coercion and intimidation vis-a-vis weaker neighbors. Even as they push the economic agenda, even as they push one belt and one road. I mean, it's really interesting to see how that's going to balance. But that's what they're doing right now. It's this idea we got to get the neighborhood to buy off on this idea of one belt, one road with its various stops and the advantages that will offer economically to all parties involved. At the same time that they're pushing pretty hard on some of those parties in terms of their differences, especially in the sort of the sovereignty domain, South China Sea issues particularly. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. Their concerns since 1979 about escalation and about how it might derail the economic miracle. I think as your military I mean, formerly the gap between military capabilities and national objectives was this. They couldn't get there with, using the military. That gap is closed. You have a military now that's much more capable of helping you achieve your national objectives. So what does that mean to your leadership? It doesn't mean they're going to pick that tool. But again, all these things kind of add up to, a big concern in terms of what the thresholds for military use are. And then, my closing bullet really is that idea that conventional deterrence, which, and when I talk about deterrence here, I'm trying not to talk about the fact that we're dealing with two nuclear states when we talk about the U.S. and China, but where we all want to be, this idea of conventional deterrence, it's ultimately based on our ability and the ability of us to contact, in concert with our allies, to prevail. And I think it's, again, there's a lot of ideas. Well, does prevail mean that you convince the PRC that, that you're imposing costs, and that they can't afford it? I don't think that works with China. They can afford it right now, and they will have a military that's commensurate with a major power. That's happening. It's it's going to happen, barring sort of internal collapse in China. It's going to happen. But I think that you can still show them that their objectives, their political objectives, can be denied. And that those costs are the ones that they don't want to strap on, because it will eventually affect all of their other objectives. Their ability to maintain their economic ascendancy, their ability to maintain domestic control, etc. So their reluctance to escalate, with the U.S. is really, I think, still the biggest hope for de-escalation if friction does increase. So it's really important, again, that Taiwan focuses on areas militarily that they can impact and potentially deny Chinese political objectives, in tandem with the U.S. on a regional basis being able to send really that same message that our abilities and our alliance structures are such that they can't get their objectives by military force. They've got to, they need to go other routes. You're really kind of buying time there, if you will. I think I'll close with that. Or how are we doing?
Yeah. You're just a little over 1 o'clock, so that's
okay.
Great. We've got those 30 minutes for Q&A.
Super.
Good.
We'll go ahead and let you call on